Have you ever heard of the Jebusites? They are mentioned discreetly in the Bible, but they played an important role in the history of Jerusalem. Before King David conquered the city and turned it into the spiritual center of Israel, that land was already inhabited by an ancient, resilient, and mysterious people, the Jebusites. They lived in the hills of Canaan and called Jerusalem Jebus. Long before it became known as the City of David, it was already a fortress surrounded by strong, well-protected walls. The Jebusites were brave warriors, known for their skill in defense and combat. When the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land, this people were among the last to resist conquest. For that reason, they became an important part of the transition between the era of the Canaanite peoples and the beginning of the Kingdom of Israel. But after all, who really were these ancient inhabitants? Why was Jerusalem so valuable to them? And how did a Jebusite named Arana become connected to the place where the future temple of the Lord would be built? The story of the Jebusites shows how God guided history to fulfill his purpose. A city that was once pagan became the spiritual heart of Israel. The past of the Jebusites is part of the path that led Jerusalem to become a symbol of God's presence and promise. Stay with me until the end of this video, because we are going to discover who these men were who lived before Israel and how their story helped shape the destiny of Jerusalem. And before continuing, leave your like. It helps a lot, so that more people can be reached by this message. The story of the Jebusites begins right after the flood, in the days of Noah. The Bible says that from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, came the peoples who spread throughout the world, Genesis chapter 10. One of Ham's sons, named Canaan, became the ancestor of several nations that occupied the region known as the land of Canaan. Among these descendants were the Jebusites, Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 to 16. This shows that they were a very ancient people, belonging to the same origin as the Canaanites, who lived there before the arrival of Israel. The Jebusites, therefore, descended from Canaan, grandson of Noah, and inherited a strong and deeply rooted tradition. When the families began to spread and occupy different territories after the dispersion of the peoples, the Jebusites chose to live in a mountainous area south of the tribe of Benjamin and near the border with Judah, the place that, in the future, would be called Jerusalem. This region was very special. Surrounded by hills and deep valleys, it offered a natural defense almost impossible to overcome. From the heights, it was easy to see any approaching enemy, which made the city extremely safe. In addition, there were sources of clean water, something essential for life at that time, and fertile lands in the nearby valleys. For all these reasons, safety, abundant water, and good location, Jerusalem became a coveted place since the most ancient times. It was a strategic, strong, and promising point, which explains why so many nations desired to conquer it throughout history. Over time, the Jebusites transformed that region into a powerful fortress. They built walls, towers, and gates, making the city respected and feared by neighboring peoples. According to the Bible and archaeological studies, the Jebusite city had a highly advanced defense system for its time. Its walls protected not only the houses and the palace, but also the underground water channels, which allowed them to endure for long periods during times of war. For this reason, Jerusalem, which was previously called Jebus, was considered almost impossible to conquer. The Jebusites were not nomads. They formed a well-organized and stable people. They had their own kings and a structured society, which gave them independence. They lived autonomously and maintained commercial exchanges with other peoples of the region. Their religion was similar to that of other Canaanite peoples. They believed in several gods and worshipped deities connected to fertility and nature, such as Baal and Ashtoreth. However, these rituals were later condemned by the prophets of Israel because they involved immoral practices and idolatry. Even with their faith directed toward other gods, the Jebusites were admired for their strength and defensive ability. They took great advantage of the privileged geographical position of their city, maintaining control over the region for many centuries. When the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob walked through the land of Canaan, the Jebusites were already well established in Jebus. The city was known and mentioned as an important reference point, showing how significant it already was on the ancient map of the Middle East. The history of the Jebusites is connected to that of the patriarchs from the earliest days of faith. Even before the people of Israel existed, God had already promised that the land where the Jebusites lived would be part of the inheritance of Abraham's descendants. In the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verses 18 to 21, this promise is clearly recorded. In that passage, the Lord makes a covenant with Abraham and declares, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Rephaim, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Girgashite, and the Jebusite." That promise was not just a spoken word, but a covenant confirmed through a symbolic act. God commanded Abraham to offer a sacrifice, and after that, the Lord himself passed between the halves of the animals, showing with fire that his word was true. This gesture represented a solemn and definitive commitment. The land of Canaan, where the Jebusites lived, would be given to the descendants of Abraham. At that time, the Jebusite city already existed and was called Salem. Located in a mountainous and strategic region, Salem was respected as an important political and religious center among the surrounding peoples. It is in this setting that an enigmatic and revered figure appears, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. The book of Genesis in chapter 14 tells that Melchizedek appeared after Abraham won a battle to rescue his nephew Lot. The king of Salem went to meet Abraham, bringing bread and wine, and blessed him in the name of the Most High God. This episode shows that even before Jerusalem became the city of David, God was already guiding his story in that place. The biblical text shows that Melchizedek was not only a king, but also a priest of the Most High God. This indicates that even before the people of Israel existed, there were already in that region, which would later become Jerusalem, people who recognized a true God, creator of the heavens and the earth. Melchizedek represents an ancient and pure faith, different from the idolatry practiced by the Canaanite peoples around. For this reason, many scholars believe that Salem, the kingdom of Melchizedek, was the ancient Jerusalem, and that this priest-king was connected to the region that would, in the future, be occupied by the Jebusites. This reveals that Jerusalem, since the time of Abraham, already possessed great spiritual and historical value. It was a stable and respected city, marked by an atmosphere of holiness surrounding its king. Later, the Jebusites, descendants of Canaan, inherited that territory and strengthened it, but the city had, from the very beginning, a special role in God's plan. The fact that the Lord included the land of the Jebusites in the promise made to Abraham shows that he had already chosen that place for a purpose far greater than simply being a city. The presence of Melchizedek in Salem also foreshadowed the eternal connection between Jerusalem and the worship of the true God. Centuries before the temple was built by Solomon, there was already a priest there dedicated to the Most High God. This demonstrates that from the very beginning of history, God was preparing that mountain, which would later be called Mount Zion, to become the center of his presence among men. The encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek is much more than a simple ancient story. It is a prophetic moment. Abraham, known as the father of faith, recognized in Melchizedek someone who served the same God. Out of respect and gratitude, he gave Melchizedek the tithe of all that he had gained. This gesture represented a spiritual connection between the two and marked the beginning of the relationship between Jerusalem and the worship of the true God. Meanwhile, the Jebusites continued living in the region, strengthening their city and expanding their domains. The Bible does not mention any conflict between Abraham and the Jebusites, which shows that they probably lived in peace during that time. However, God had already determined the destiny of that land. Even though the Jebusites were still the owners of Jerusalem, the Lord had already promised that it would belong to the descendants of Abraham. That promise was passed down from generation to generation, from Abraham to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, and from Jacob to the people of Israel. Each generation kept alive the memory that the land of the Jebusites had a purpose defined by God. Jerusalem, which would later be conquered by King David, was already part of God's divine plan long before Israel existed as a nation. Therefore, the history of the Jebusites does not begin with their defeat, but with their importance and antiquity. They inhabited a city that, even under Canaanite rule, already possessed a special character. Since the days of Abraham and Melchizedek, Jerusalem, or Salem, was seen as a separate, sacred, and significant place. And over time, the fulfillment of God's promise would transform that ancient fortified city into the center of faith for the chosen people, the dwelling place of the living God. Many years later, when Moses died, the people of Israel came to be led by Joshua, the faithful servant who had walked with him in the desert. God gave Joshua the mission of leading the tribes to the promised land. Under his leadership, Israel crossed the Jordan River and began several battles against the Canaanite peoples who lived in the region promised to Abraham. It was a time of great victories in which powerful cities were defeated by the power of God. But among all the conquered fortresses, one remained firm and resistant: Jebus, the city that would later be known as Jerusalem. During the campaigns, Joshua defeated many kings and nations. The Bible recounts the victories over Jericho, Ai, the Amorite kings, and the kings of the north, as well as the conquest of important cities such as Hazor, Makkedah, and Lachish. The people of Israel advanced and established themselves in the land, fulfilling the promise of the Lord. However, even with so many triumphs, some territories remained under the control of the ancient peoples. Among them was the fortress of the Jebusites, located in the mountains between the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. In the book of Joshua, chapter 15, verse 63, it is written, "But the children of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem, and so the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day." This passage shows that despite the great conquests, Jerusalem, still called Jebus, remained partially under the control of the Jebusites. The city was so well protected that it remained one of the last Canaanite strongholds. Its strategic position and strong walls made it a real challenge for the Israelites. Thus, even after most of the Promised Land had been occupied, Jerusalem remained a symbol of resistance and an obstacle to the full conquest of the territory promised by God. The difficulty in conquering Jebus came mainly from its location. The city was built on top of a mountain, surrounded by deep valleys, the valley of Kidron on one side and the valley of Hinnom on the other, which made it a natural fortress. Moreover, the Jebusites reinforced the city with thick walls and watchtowers, creating a defense system almost impossible to overcome. Because of that, Jebus was considered one of the safest cities in the entire region. The Jebusites were known for their courage and endurance. They knew the mountainous terrain well and used it to their advantage in every battle. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin, who were supposed to conquer that area, could not completely drive them out. Even with some victories in isolated battles, the Jebusites continued to dominate the main part of the city, especially the fortress located on Mount Zion. This prolonged presence turned them into a symbol of resistance before Israel. The presence of the Jebusites in Jerusalem was so significant that, even after the division of the lands among the tribes, they remained there for many generations. The book of Judges, chapter 1, verse 21, confirms this. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. Instead, the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. This shows that even after the death of Joshua and the advance of the Israelite tribes, the Jebusites remained firm, keeping control of part of the city and resisting the complete conquest of the Promised Land. The coexistence between the Israelites and the Jebusites became a constant reminder that there were still enemy peoples living in the Promised Land. God had commanded that the Canaanites be completely expelled because of their idolatry and sinful practices, but the people of Israel did not fully obey that command. The Jebusites, in turn, continued to maintain their culture and religion, which later brought spiritual and moral difficulties to the neighboring tribes. The resistance of the Jebusites was not only military, it also had symbolic meaning. Jebus represented an unconquered barrier, a part of God's promise that had not yet been fully fulfilled. As long as that city remained outside Israel's dominion, the divine plan to make it the spiritual center of the nation, the place of the temple and of God's presence, was not yet complete. The Jebusites eventually became a symbol of human resistance to the plans of the Lord. Their city was fortified, difficult to conquer, and they trusted so much in their defenses that they became proud. During the period of the Judges, they continued living among the tribes of Israel, but without losing their independence and identity. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua was great, but not total. God had given the land, but the people still needed to act with faith and obedience to possess it completely. The Jebusites remained as a reminder of that truth. Their fortress in Jerusalem resisted for many centuries, until a man after God's own heart, King David, finally accomplished what Joshua and the tribes had not been able to do, to take the city and make it the center of faith in Israel. After many centuries of Jebusite resistance, the moment finally came when the ancient fortress of Jebus would be conquered. This happened in the time of King David and is recorded in 2 Samuel chapters 5 verses 6 through 9, one of the most important episodes in the history of Israel. David had been anointed king over all the people, uniting the tribes that had previously been divided. A new era was beginning, and the first great step of his reign would be to take the city that would become the spiritual and political center of Israel, Jerusalem. For many centuries, the Jebusites lived peacefully in the fortress of Jebus. Even after the campaigns of Joshua and the period of the Judges, they remained in control of the city. Its strong walls and location on top of a mountain surrounded by deep valleys made any invasion almost impossible. The passages leading up to it were narrow and dangerous, which made the Jebusites believe that no one could ever defeat them. That confidence, however, would soon be tested by David. Newly crowned, David needed to choose a capital that did not belong only to one tribe, but would serve the entire people of Israel. Jerusalem was the ideal place. It was located between the territories of Judah and Benjamin, in a central position and easily accessible from all regions of the kingdom. But the choice was not only strategic, it was also spiritual. Jerusalem was the ancient city of Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem, who had blessed Abraham many centuries earlier. It was a land marked by promises and significance, a place that God had already declared as part of Israel's inheritance since the time of the patriarchs. When David decided to conquer Jerusalem, he knew he would face a strong enemy. The Jebusites were experienced warriors and knew every part of the city very well. When David and his army approached, the Jebusites began to mock them. The Bible says they declared, "You shall not come in here, even the blind and the lame can repel you." 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 6. In other words, they were so confident in their fortress that they thought it was impossible to be defeated. Words of pride and provocation. But David was not intimidated. He had something the Jebusites did not possess, the guidance of God and the wisdom to act. The biblical text shows that David discovered a secret passage leading from outside the city into the heart of the fortress, an underground water channel later known as the Tunnel of Siloam. This conduit reached the Gihon spring, which supplied the city with water. Taking advantage of this hidden entrance, David and his men managed to enter the Jebusite fortress and take its defenders by surprise. With courage and strategy, David and his soldiers won the battle. The Jebusites, who for many centuries had trusted in their walls, were defeated. Thus, the ancient city of Jebus became part of Israel, ending the Canaanite rule that had lasted since the time of Joshua. This conquest represented far more than a military victory. It was the fulfillment of the promise God had made to Abraham. The land of the Jebusites finally belonged to the descendants of the patriarch, and Jerusalem became the new center of the nation chosen by God. After the victory, David began to live in the conquered fortress and gave it the name City of David. This was a very important moment, not only militarily but also spiritually. Jerusalem became the center of the new unified kingdom and the symbol of the covenant between God and his people. From there, David would reign, bring the Ark of the Covenant, and establish the greatest reign in the history of Israel. The ancient fortress of the Jebusites was now the heart of a kingdom dedicated to the Lord. The conquest of Jerusalem also revealed David's character. He did not win only by strength, but by faith and wisdom. While the Jebusites trusted in their walls, David trusted in God. That difference changed everything. The pride of the Jebusites led them to downfall, but the humility and confidence of David led him to victory. The taking of the city marked the end of Canaanite rule and the beginning of a new era in Israel's history. From that moment on, the name Jebus disappeared, giving way to Jerusalem, the city that would be known as the center of God's presence on earth. The Jebusites ceased to exist as an independent people, and the city they had built with such effort became the throne of the king chosen by God. What once symbolized pride and resistance was transformed into a sign of the Lord's victory over the enemies of his people. Thus, the conquest of Jerusalem by David was much more than a military triumph. It was the fulfillment of an ancient promise and an act of faith. From then on, a new era began. Jerusalem would become the center of worship to God and the stage where the divine plan would continue to be revealed to humanity. Even after King David conquered Jerusalem, the Jebusites did not disappear completely. After the victory, David made the city his capital, calling it the City of David. He expanded and strengthened the old Jebusite fortress, and Jerusalem began to grow in political, military, and spiritual importance. However, the Bible shows that not all Jebusites were killed or expelled. In passages such as Joshua chapter 15, verse 63, it is said that many of those Canaanite peoples, among them the Jebusites, continued to live in the land, now under Israel's rule. They began to serve as workers, helping in construction, farming, and the defense of the kingdom. The text in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 20 and 21 explains, "All the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the children of Israel, their descendants who remained in the land, those whom the children of Israel were not able to utterly destroy, Solomon made them forced laborers to this day." This shows that even after David, there were still Jebusites in Israel, but now as part of the kingdom's society, they ceased to be an independent nation and began living under the rule of the kings chosen by God, integrating into the new reality of Israelite dominion. Among the Jebusites still mentioned in the Bible, one name stands out: Arana, the Jebusite. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 18 through 25, he appears at a decisive moment in the life of King David. After disobeying God by conducting a census of the people, David saw a plague strike Israel as a punishment. Repentant, he sought the Lord's forgiveness, and the prophet Gad commanded him to build an altar in a specific place, the threshing floor of Arana the Jebusite. Arana is not portrayed in the Bible as an enemy, but as a respectful and generous man. When King David went to him to buy the land, Arana offered to give it for free, along with oxen and wood for the sacrifice. But David refused and answered with a phrase that would become famous: "No, I will pay the fair price, for I will not offer to the Lord my God sacrifices that cost me nothing." 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 24. Then the king bought the land for 50 shekels of silver and built an altar there to the Lord. He offered sacrifices, and God stopped the plague that was striking Israel. This event carries a very deep meaning. The land of a Jebusite, a people who had once resisted Israel, became the place of an altar dedicated to the true God. And it was on that very spot that, years later, King Solomon built the Temple of the Lord, known as Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount, 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Thus the ground that once belonged to the Jebusites became the most sacred point of Israel's faith. The gesture of Arana and the attitude of David connect the past to the future. The city that once represented resistance to the people of God became the center of his presence among men. This episode shows how God is able to completely transform places and people. The ancient fortress of Israel's enemies became the throne of the king chosen by God, and the field of a Jebusite became the altar where worship and forgiveness met, the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between God and his people. As the centuries passed, the name Jebusite disappeared from history as the identification of a people. There are no more records of them as a nation or tribe. Even so, the legacy they left behind remains alive, not as a symbol of resistance, but as part of God's plan. The city they built and defended for so long became Jerusalem, the spiritual and prophetic center of biblical faith. The ancient Jebus came to represent the meeting point between God and mankind. It was there that the temple was built, there the prophets preached, and there Christ was crucified and resurrected. What was once a Canaanite city was transformed by the hand of God into the main stage of the story of salvation. Even though the Jebusites disappeared, their story did not end in defeat, but in transformation. The city they built with such effort was chosen to become the symbol of God's presence on earth. The ancient Jebusite fortress became the city of David, later the city of the great king, and finally the heavenly Jerusalem, mentioned in the scriptures. The place that once symbolized resistance became the center of the eternal hope of God's people. Now tell me in the comments, had you already heard the story of the Jebusites in the Bible? Share this teaching with more people. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and keep following the next videos. May God bless your life.